Well, welcome back, everybody, to another edition of Stand on Guard. I'm your host, David Krayden, and it's a real pleasure today to have Dr. Regina Watteel on. She will be talking about her book, and it is really fascinating, and it's a great read. But we'll be back in a moment to discuss.
So we are in a very precarious position in this country. We need political change, but we also need the resolve to resist.
Hope you're enjoying this interview. If you want to see the complete interview, please go to Rumble, and you can find how to do that in the description below. And if you want to see the entire broadcast, which is really quite fantastic, please do so. And like Sasha, my cat, demonstrates, please ring the bell, like this broadcast now. Let's beat that YouTube algorithm. And let's continue to beat Trudeau's censorship. Please subscribe to the station if you already haven't. If you have to resubscribe, please do so. YouTube is terrible at unsubscribing people. I hear that all the time. So, Regina, Dr. Watteel, it is so nice to have you here. I saw your interview on Redacted with Natalie Morris the other day, and as I said, I'm on Redacted every week myself, talking about Canadian news. So when I saw that interview, I said, I really need to talk to this woman, and it was so great to see your book, which I will put up here. It is now number 1 on Amazon, and that is just such exciting news. And of course, if you need to get this book on Amazon, it's called Fistman's Fraud, and we'll get into what that means in a minute. But it was incredible because I was there watching when Clayton Morris said, "Let's push this book to the top of Amazon. Let's have everybody watching buy a copy." So it must have worked, eh?
Yeah, it's been crazy the last 48 hours. I can't tell you just how crazy and busy it's been. And when I woke up and I looked, and it actually did. It went to number 1 in Canada out of all the books, and I was like, I don't even know what to say. I'm so appreciative, especially of Natalie and Clayton. It's been great. It's been a pretty difficult getting the word out. It was growing, and things have really taken off in the last 2 days.
Well, I'm sure they have, and it shows the power of independent journalism, social media today. I don't think that would happen if you appeared on CBC, for instance, or if you appeared on much of the mainstream media. The effect is instantaneous and it's explosive when people have books mentioned or people are asked to go to a website. They do so. They respond on social media, and it's really quite incredible. So, congratulations! It's nice to see your book there. But I briefly want to put a picture up of the study your book is all about. And of course, this produced by David Fistman and others out of the University of Toronto. And it's called The Impact of Population Mixing Between Vaccinated and Unvaccinated Subpopulations on Infectious Disease Dynamic Implications for SARS-CoV-2 Transmission. Now, I just looked at the website again for the CMAJ, and there it is, still up. Nobody is saying it shouldn't be, except you and others who know what this is all about. But I just want to quote briefly from your book when you talk about this. And I think this says so much of it. Is that within hours of the study's official publication, articles in dozens of top newspapers and magazines flooded the nation, warning of the dire risk of merely hanging out with unvaccinated people. The vaccine was touted as powerful and stifling, and stifling COVID. Yet it was incapable of protecting the population so long as the unvaccinated were present. Somehow the absurd notion spread like wildfire. And I think that is fundamentally what your book is all about. But having looked at this study, would you say that the fundamental flaw of the study was that it did not deal with people who actually had COVID, but with some hypothetical respiratory
Um,
problem?
well, it was completely made up. There was no basis in what was actually going on. But the main problem was that they try to pass it off like it was real, like it was based on fact. And I did a comparison when CMAJ wouldn't retract this paper. I went and I looked at the preprints that were put out before the final publication because they were available online as well. And what I found was shocking, that during the peer review process, there was a there was an effort made to make the model appear like it was based on real people. So one of the things you notice from the preprint, that the word people was only mentioned one time, but in the final version, the version that went out in the CMAJ publication, people was mentioned 76 times. So they just people. They wanted the appearance that it was based on people and not just a model. And I found that deeply disturbing.
But this study, you say they flipped reality uh, in doing the study, and in so saying, you mean that they basically falsified evidence, or what does that mean when they flipped reality?
Okay, well, the study came out after the Omicron surge. All right, so we had data readily available on the official Government of Ontario website that showed what the incident rates for COVID really were. So we had the trend. If you looked at the government website, it's right there. It doesn't take any analysis. You just have to print the screen. It's that easy. And it showed
Yep.
that incident rates, COVID incident rates amongst the vaccinated were disproportionately higher than those of the unvaccinated during the Omicron surge. All right. So it's opposite to what the media was running with. It's opposite to what the politicians were saying. And it was readily available. And then what David Fisman and his colleagues did is they modeled basically the Omicron surge, but in their model, they had it opposite. They had the unvaccinated had higher rates than the vaccinated, and that just merely hanging out with them was a risk to others. So yes, they fabricated the data and the results, tried to pass it off as a true reflection of reality, but they also completely ignored readily available information that said the opposite of what they were trying to show. So that's two types of fraud, actually, because you have fabrication and falsification.
And clearly, anybody who watched this pandemic unfold would know that getting the vaccine was absolutely no guarantee that you weren't going to get COVID. And yet this study seems to suggest that not getting the vaccine somehow makes you a lawless individual who's guilty of all sorts of things. And I like what you do here, and the player in the politics is that you break it down into who is responsible for this. And you say, first of all, the Canadian Medical Association Journal, which published this, the University of Toronto, which facilitated the research, and of course, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, which is a federally funded agency. So Canadians funded this study. Canadians paid for this study. It is still out there being lauded by Canadian politicians whenever they're asked. I mean, is this not an outrage that Canadian taxpayers were forced to pay for such a fundamentally flawed study?
They were forced to pay for the study, and the study within days was waved around in Parliament to justify extending the travel restrictions. And it's been, the whole pandemic of the unvaccinated, that never really went away. They like to blame the unvaccinated for everything. it is horrible that not only do we pay for it, but the way it's being used going forward. When you look at the study itself and the main reason for that study, it was to undermine the notion that vaccine choice is best left to the individual. So it's setting up the reasoning for future mandates. Basically, vaccination affects everybody, so it really shouldn't just be up to the individual. And I think this is why you won't see this study going away, because if you shine a light on this study, it actually shows the very opposite. It shows what the government did was not only wrong, but they themselves could have been the ones putting everybody at risk by bringing about these mandates. So it actually shows the opposite of what they want. So there is issues with them retracting it, because they really do want to push for possible future mandates, not just the past ones.
And there's a vested interest here too, isn't there? Because you point out that the University of Toronto has received money from Big Pharma. I believe it was Moderna. But I think the same can be said of a lot of other players here. Is Big Pharma a commonality here? Is this a link in terms of why people continue to defend this study?
There's a lot of conflicts of interest. So Big Pharma, yeah, there's a lot of connections with all the pharmaceutical companies. When you look at Visman, he's been on the advisory boards of not just Moderna, but on Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and others. And like you mentioned, University of Toronto has a partnership with Moderna, so that's a huge conflict of interest. And also, a lot of the universities have received funding, federal funding, to combat vaccine hesitancy. There's a lot of money involved.
And I would also include the mainstream media as one of the perpetrators here, one of the villains in publicizing this report. And I think it's interesting if you watch the news. I mean, who is providing the funding for much of the advertising these days? It's impossible to watch CNN, MSNBC, and even Fox increasingly without seeing Big Pharma dominate the advertising space. So clearly the media has a vested interest in promoting this as well, and promoting this mythology surrounding the pandemic. And I think it's absolutely fascinating. It affected your family. The pandemic affected your family in a very big way, and the attitude towards the unvaccinated affected your family. I think you were saying that your children were affected in their sports interests.
Well, they're affected in a lot of ways. Sports was a big one because prior to the pandemic, our family was very much into sports. So I had an accident many years ago, and because of that accident, there was, a real focus on health and fitness, and also I wanted, to focus on my children and their dreams. So sports was a huge part of that. All three of my kids were active. The older two were in university and varsity athletics, and they had qualified for the nationals. They were on the track and field team. My son even won the athlete of the year for varsity track and field right before Omicron. Not Omicron, right before the pandemic was called. And they have been banned from competitions. They've never gone back because they were not allowed on campus. They weren't allowed to compete with their teams. So it totally destroyed their athletics. And my youngest, he was only in grade 8 when the pandemic was called. So it really impacted high school. And he was into hockey. He was into softball. And he was not allowed in any of those things throughout high school. So they don't have that in their lives anymore. And for my older two, yes, they weren't even allowed on campus. And people think, oh, you can just do school online. But what they might not realize is that a lot of 3rd and 4th year courses were not offered online. So you couldn't do that. And then, of course, people who have practicals, like my daughter was starting teachers college, so she had to drop out for the year because you weren't allowed to do that. You weren't allowed to do your in-class, I guess, when you go to the schools and that. So they weren't allowed.
Yes.
And then my daughter had found it was so hard here in Ottawa. We're in Ottawa that, you know, she's actually moved out west now, and she's having, it was much easier for her there. So yeah, it's impacted my children in a huge way. But even beyond that, like my husband, he worked for the federal government, so the mandates impacted him, and so he didn't work for much of 2022. He was, you know, we tried many different avenues to get an exemption to the vaccines and the mandates, but our exemption always focused on basically human rights, that they don't have the right to decide for us. We didn't ask for a religious exemption or any exemption for medical reasons. It was basic human rights. And the fact that both of us are scientists, like we both have PhDs in science, we can decide for ourselves how the science works. And but they denied his exemption. His exemption was denied 2 days before Christmas of 2021. So it was so stressful. I can't tell you how stressful fall of 2021 was. And then on top of that, I had several siblings who were in a similar situation. So my sister, who was a heart technologist, she was fired. She was fired from her job. It was awful what she went through. A lot of the healthcare workers went through. The stress on the healthcare workers was horrible. My brother's also in the healthcare profession. He's a respiratory therapist, and I do feel for healthcare workers. It has been really, really hard on them. It is not, a lot of their workplaces, it was toxic for them. And then my other brother, again, like it just across the field, our family really suffered. But we're not the only ones, and we're not even the worst off. A lot of people suffered more than we did, much more.
Yes. Yeah. I'm becoming increasingly aware of how widespread that it has been. Now, you coined a new word. I think it's a new word in your book. Hate science. I mean, the Trudeau government loves to talk about hate speech, which is really anything they don't want to agree with. When it comes down to it, how would you define hate science?
I would define hate science as scientific fraud, falsification, fabrication, for the purpose of scapegoating an identifiable group, right? So that was the purpose behind the study, is to cause harm to individuals. So this study by Fisman and his colleagues, when you look at it, the purpose behind it was to blame the unvaccinated for the failure of the vaccines and to justify punishing them for it. So there was, using their fabricated results, they wanted to justify things like vaccine mandates and travel restrictions and banning us from public venues. That was a main goal behind the actual science. Well, it's not actually science.
Pseudoscience, yes.
Hate science, yes.
I think it's an excellent way to describe what you're talking about. Now, you've challenged this study, I use that in quotation marks, quite comprehensively, not just in a book, but you have challenged institutions in this province and in Canada, all the way up to the OPP. Can you just take us through how many institutions you actually challenged the study to, and did they all stonewall you? Did you get any kind of real response back?
Well, the first institution I went to was the Canadian Medical Association Journal, because they published the study. So I did a full critique of the study, as well as pointing out that it was fraudulent. And I asked them to retract the paper. And I also discussed in my submission, I discussed the harms that it was doing to Canadians. And they did not engage in dialogue. I just got a form letter basically saying, we received your materials, and that was it. So I even tried to post on their website, right where the study is located, as a response, but it never did get posted. But many other scientists also complained, and their some of their letters went on the website. So you can see that other scientists came forward and, said, gave rebukes about the study. I was not the only one who asked for a retraction. Many people asked for the study to be retracted, but still it's not retracted. When they refused to engage in any kind of dialogue, I then went to the University of Toronto. And I asked them to investigate the researchers and called for a retraction of the paper as well. And at first, they basically said that, what he did wasn't covered in their framework, that it was par for the course, and this is just the way science basically works. They tried to act like it was a difference of scientific opinion, but this was not a difference of scientific opinion. This was blatant scientific fraud, and that is covered in their guidelines. So I went through their guidelines and highlighted the exact sections that cover this and asked them to reconsider. And then there was some back and forth where they tried to deflect what he had done, misrepresent what he had done. And then finally, when I kept going back and clarifying so that there was no wiggle room for misinterpretation. And when I felt I had done that, they just closed the file. They said, nope, it's closed, case closed. So then I went to the funding agency. And that is the process. You're supposed to go through the University of Toronto before going through CIHR. So when University of Toronto closed the file, I went to the Canadian Institute for Health Research, and I asked them to investigate not only Visman and his colleagues at this time, but also the University of Toronto for, not doing a proper investigation. And CIHR, the president of CIHR, NSERC, and SSHRC, from my understanding from the exchange I've had with CIHR, is that the presidents got together and voted to do nothing, voted to let the false records stand. And I thought this was horrific because they are answerable to Parliament. Parliament waved the study around for justification to keep the travel restrictions in place. And so there was a duty for them to correct that record, and they voted not to. So at that point, I was getting some signals that would be the end result. And I had already started working on a report to the Ontario Provincial Police Anti-Rackets Branch. And that's, so I did actually talk to a couple of OPP officers before I submitted to get a little bit of help of what to include in this report. And I sent that off. A few months after that, they got back to me, and I had a couple of interviews, but it was pretty clear they didn't want to look into this. So and again, at each step, I always think to myself, well, what if they won't investigate either? What am I going to do? So I had already started preparing to write this book, because if they weren't going to investigate, I wasn't going to let it go, because I know how dangerous the study is, and I know how it's being used.
Yes. Have you been threatened, legally or otherwise, since your book has appeared?
No, I've actually, so this is interesting, because I was, concerned when I went to publish the book, because, nobody wants to get into a lawsuit, especially I look at what's been going on in Canada, and they put people through the ringer. But at the same time, I knew I had to get it out, and I felt I had done it in a way that showed that I tried everything else. I really did try to go through the process, CMAJ, University of Toronto, CIHR, OPP. I tried everything I possibly could to get the record corrected, and they just refused to do it. So I really felt I had no choice but to do a book, so I did it. And the feedback generally has been positive from other scientists and positive from the public, and absolute crickets. It's quiet when it comes to Visman, his colleagues, the University of Toronto. It's like they're maybe hoping it will just, go away. So it's been great the last 48 hours since redacted, because they really shone a light on what's going on. So it has less chance of just going away. It has more chance of making an impact. So I'm really grateful.
Well, I think the very fact that you did not have any reaction from the perpetrators of this study indicates the truthfulness of your book, because otherwise they would be after you. And I think they might take a little more notice now that the book is #1 on Amazon, but I still don't think there's any chance of them trying to refute what you put together in this book, because it is rock solid. And that's one thing I want to make that point to viewers. This book is rock solid. This is not musings. This is not hyperbole. This is not just hypotheses without evidence. This is incredibly comprehensive. And I think this is an indictment of what happened to Canadians. And right now, I want to invite you to move over to Rumble. You can see how to do that in the description below, but we will be leaving YouTube at this time and moving over to Rumble. Thanks so much for watching thus far.